Hello and welcome to No Confidence. My name is David Merlin. I'm your host. Nothing you'll hear me say is intended as legal advice. Anything that sounds like that to you, just consider it something somebody else might do on a planet far, far away where the law matters. It doesn't matter here. I prove it on a daily basis. Believe it. It's August 27th, 2019. I am recording this loosely at this end. It's no big deal. Nothing I've got prepared remarks for. But people have to know. You gotta spare me. David Champion said in his second to the most recent video on his, I think he calls himself Dr. Truth or something. And he says in there, you know, I sit back and I look at the anti-tax movement and all there is me over here and Pete Hendrickson. And that's all he said. Oh, he said somebody has proclaimed themselves to be a messiah and then said a few things that indicates it's obviously not me. So he doesn't recognize me in his video, which is great. That means he doesn't view me as part of the anti-tax movement. Right on. But he also can't talk about my arguments. Dave Merlin and his wacky Section 83 argument. What's wacky about it? It's a statute. You have to comply with it. Everybody has to follow it. Everybody. Period. Oh, it's wacky. And so he spares himself the trauma, I guess it would be, for him to have to decipher Section 83 and its implementing regulations. It was in my 1994 treatise on the way the IRS breaks the law. And nobody else has a moment for it. That's 26 years, almost, since I wrote that treatise, after 5.5 years of research and administrative attempts to get the IRS to speak of those provisions you see on the homepage of takefromcaesar.us. So nobody's interested, but they got a big mouth, and they have to be put in their places on takefromcaesar.us. Scroll down the homepage below the picture of a check for $25,000, and you'll find a section called Links. In there, there's a link that says Cracking the Code, My Review. Here's that link again to the review itself in PDF format. One of those links, it says Cracking the Code, My Review, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. One of those links will take you to... the name of the case escapes me, tax court case where tax court reviews Cracking the Code, chapter by chapter. And so Pete's a whooping boy, and I'm proud to do it because people simply have to be warned. Pete, in a very broad bottom line assessment of the tax code, says that its nature is to impose a tax on a privilege granted by the federal government, and spend some time in chapter 24, as you'll see in the review. But he says the privilege is working for the federal government. It's a tax on the privilege. I can destroy that entire conclusion with one question. How did Section 83 operate in your conclusion a federal public servant would owe a tax on their paycheck? Oh, he's never considered Section 83. You'll see a quote from him in the review. Let me back up to that. A student of mine inquired to him, hey, what about Dave Merlin's Section 83 argument? And he replies by saying, I'm scrolling for this. I don't want to get it wrong. It's profound how quickly he dismisses it. Beginning at the bottom of page 5. January of 06, a friend of mine forwarded this to me from an author he had approached with my work. My friend was trying to spark the author's interest in the criminal complaint I filed with Congress, New Year's of 06, since his book claims to be cracking the code, but was disappointed to learn that the author didn't know anything about tax law. Zero. And here's the email back from Pete Hendrickson. dear, let's say Bradley, Section 83, of which this fellow makes so much, is intended to address stock options as a form of compensation and was only added to the law in 1969. Please stick with what you have learned in Cracking the Code. It's the real deal and the complete deal as well. Don't forget to visit my website. It was intended to address stock options. Who gives a damn? The case law, the appellate case law, that means it's clearly established case law, clearly established law, says Section 83 governs, and the IRS doesn't deny it. In all those years I've litigated it, and he doesn't have time for it. He brushes it off as, oh, it was intended as this or that. That means he read this case law on it and said, screw that, it's only intended for restricted stock plans. He blew it. So he's derelict as a researcher. On the homepage of takefromcaesar.us, I liken him to puppy barf when he's compared to an actual researcher, such as myself. And let me remind everybody, the complaint I filed with 80 members of Congress, New Year's of '06, one of my co-complainants had a 58-page memorandum, 33-page racketeering and extortion complaint, 22 counts, I think. One of the people that signed off on my treatise, my complaint, under oath, that the government was violating the law that way, was, in 2006, a 33-year self-employed accountant and a 33-year enrolled agent to the IRS. For 33 years, he had been certified by the IRS as an enrolled agent to represent people at audits and at hearings and to negotiate payment of tax liability. He analyzed my entire treatise and then said, yeah, I'll sign under penalties of perjury. That's exactly how things work. So, who is David Champion? Who is Pete Hendrickson? I'm on page 16 of the review. Let me put that into the chat again. My review of Cracking the Code. And on page 16, there's a, what do you call it? A blog entry on markstevens.net. And when I put the cursor on that little thought bubble, you get the web address for this blog. And here's what happens when Pete is at work. On the blog, RJ says, February 12th of 2015 at 1:34 p.m., I would also like to see some of the responses to the IRS when they get posted, but we'll go back and listen to the recording in the meantime. My wife and I got swept up in the Pete H movement starting back in 2008. Big mistake. We received everything back for 2008, 9, and 10. Then things went south after that. As of last month, we've been hit with 14 of the $5,000 frivolous penalties, totaling $70,000 for 11, 12, and 13. They like to hit both spouses with the $5,000 penalty at the same time now. So we have 6 times 5,000 penalties for 2011, 2 of 5K for 2012, and 6 of 5K for 2013. We've always chosen written correspondence over telephone conversations so that we would have documentation of everything. Plus, we didn't have a good way to record phone calls. Now they just keep hitting us both with $5,000 penalties whenever we send them a letter asking for clarification of the penalties. Had we been good little boy and girl and filed correctly, their term, for the last 3 years, we would have only owed a grand total of $3,000. Now here we sit, both 50 years old, with $70,000 of IRS debt hanging over our heads for friggin' penalty fees, only one job between us. Oh, and did I mention we had to move into a hotel? Thankfully, we have no property they can take, but once they garnish the payroll, we are sunk and no longer have a rope to even hold on to. Funny thing is, we did file corrected returns within the 30-day window they threatened us with in order to avoid the penalty, but lo and behold, they still hit us with $5,000 penalties. So, do you think we have any kind of a chance in our situation if we challenge jurisdiction at this point? As long as I have air in my lungs, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to obtain a successful outcome. Thanks for all you do, Mark. We've been following your site for a couple of years now and enjoy the education. End quote. So that's what happens when Pete Hendrickson has his way. Another thing that happens when Pete Hendrickson has his way. I'm on takefromcaesar.us homepage, and I scroll. I see the section called Not in the Movement in red on the left, and then The Movement in red on the left, and there's a link in these paragraphs that says, but Pete gets results like this man. This man is James Back in Alaska, Anchorage, Alaska, tax evasion case. This is the government's trial memorandum. The memorandum the government filed before they took this guy to trial on tax charges for 6 Pete Hendrickson tax returns, 16 months in prison. Guilty. Okay? So Pete Hendrickson has left a wake of devastation, and thousands of people have been levied into poverty, maybe tens of thousands, over those frivolous filing penalties. And he still sells his book. I'm in the business of trying to keep people out of prison. Pete is in the business of putting people in prison. That's the anti-tax movement. As far as I can tell, David Champion doesn't say file a certain type of tax return. I'm not going to buy his book because he's wrong. We'll get to that in just a second. So I'm not going to waste $250 on it like I saw it on Amazon, or $60 like somebody told me on my YouTube channel. It doesn't matter. If it was 5 cents, I'm buying toilet paper instead. Why would I buy something wrong? His video proves him wrong. So I saw the frivolous filing penalties destroy people in 1992 and turned away from the anti-tax movement and their non-resident alien claims, and went back to the tax code on page 1 and began to read. Then I began to learn. I'd already studied a bunch of findings by other people, and so I was familiar with a lot of different statutes, some of them very complex. And then I went to page 1 of the tax code and began reading, and it started to make sense the more I read. And in just 3 or 4 months, the tax code organized itself right in front of me. All my self-acquired knowledge suddenly found a pattern of understanding and uniformity. You could actually grasp bigger concepts than anybody had conveyed to me in their writings when I was engaged in my prior research. And all the while on a steady diet of tax law, or case law, You can't read too much case law. I've been teaching it forever. You can't read too much case law. When judges are willing to write, that's when they think they can get away with it. When the judge just throws a bunch of crap at you and doesn't explain your argument away, that's when they're screwing you. So, case law, federal appellate, and federal Supreme Court decisions. That's how you learn what your rights are. Personally, I would urge you to read the cases I cite, of course, because they support the conclusions that I've written. You can read other cases, but make them high authorities, federal appellate and federal Supreme Court cases that the government lost. That's the main umbrella you want to study in all of your research. You want to study cases the government lost. That's called the definition of innocence. That's the most important thing to know. The most important 5 words to know in the English language. I didn't violate any law. Because criminal intent is an essential element of every criminal statute. Let me give you a crash course on that, a link to it. I'm not going to give you a whole course on it in this call, but on takefromcaesar.us, below the picture of the check for $25,000 that I made when I sued the city of Kirkland, there's a segment called Links. And in the left-hand group of links, there's a link that says, Don't Say Threat. Here's a tutorial on the word threat and how it's simply thrown around recklessly when it can really screw somebody. To be accused of having made a threat, law enforcement goes on alert. They put on the gas masks, pick up the rifles, and they're in your back door and your front door, and everybody goes to prison. So you have to be careful when you say the word threat. But the tutorial about the word threat shows you that a reliance upon federal appellate and Supreme Court decisions, and there's a link to each of the decisions. I made it really easy on that page for you to find the cases that I cited when briefing what is and is not a threat, because of how recklessly I see the word thrown around. So David Champion, enough about Pete Hendrickson. He's puppy barf compared to real researchers. David Champion has concluded that Chapter 3 is for him, baby. He's a non-resident alien in a foreign corporation. And says, Tax Code Section 7701A30, the definition of U.S. person. A U.S. person is a citizen of the U.S. Well, I'm not a citizen of the U.S. I'm in Chapter 3, which is called non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. In the 31 years I've been in this, I've never encountered anyone from whom the IRS was seeking a Chapter 3 tax. Not once. Never once. And David Champion is actually the only one I've encountered that's keen on that argument. Others have mentioned it, but it's a staple of David Champion's. He's wrong. The IRS uses Chapters 1, 2, 21, and 23 to impose taxes, and Chapter 24 to impose the W-4 withholding method, which will equal out at the end of the year against the tax imposed by Chapter 1 of the Tax Code, Section 1, the graduated income tax. So why the interest in Chapter 3? Does he claim that's where he should be taxed? Well, it imposes a rate of tax. So he's flapping in the breeze. And on just that point, it doesn't just reveal that he's wrong. It reveals that he spent 17 years down rabbit holes that the government won't even acknowledge. I've got the government to acknowledge, and this is on wevgov.com. I'm going to go to the wevgov.com federal income taxation page. And what do I see? I see a ton of case law that says Regulation 1.1-1 identifies the subject of the tax. You can't identify the subject of a tax with a regulation. It has to be a statute. The 16th Amendment says it has to be a statute. Congress has the authority to lay and collect the tax. So there's my first argument, totally based on law. And I think I have 29 decisions from tax court, federal appellate court, that say 1.1-1, the citizen that owes the tax. How come we can't just say Section 1 of the tax code? Because Section 1 of the tax code doesn't mention anybody's citizenship. It doesn't identify a subject to the tax. So just one argument, and I just destroyed the application of Chapter 1, which is capital gains and income tax. I just barred it from application to any citizen of the United States, which is what they say all of us are. We are all citizens of the United States. Everyone has to comply with the tax code. Begin. That's where I begin. Okay, everybody has to comply with the tax code. Chapter 1, it doesn't name a subject to the tax. And you wrote a regulation, 26 CFR 1.1-1, to name a subject to the tax. Subject of the tax. Excuse me. You can't identify the subject of a tax with a regulation. It violates the 16th Amendment that says only Congress can lay and collect a tax. They can't even speak of this argument, the provisions in it, and they've had it over 26 years. Here you go. It's in the chat. There's the page. It has a tutorial about it here on TalkShoe. So that's one key argument, but it doesn't take out Social Security in chapters 2, 21, and 23, does it? And so you go back to the, where the hell did I go? Okay, I want the federal income tax. Here we go. No, the federal income taxation page. I got too many pages open right now. That's what I did to myself. Okay, here we go. This link is directly to the federal income taxation page on wevgov.com. And when you start at the top of that page, there's the first argument. First thing I do is I kill Social Security in chapters 2, 21, and 23. I'm not even going to mention the W-4 form on this page because it doesn't impose a rate of tax. And if I can prove a rate or a tax is not imposed upon me, why should I argue how they have to withhold it? That shows another vacancy in Pete Hendrickson's conclusions. He thinks the W-4 is an important deal, and he's wrong. So here are the statutes on Social Security, the identity of the citizen who is subject. And these aren't me. I'm a citizen of the United States, and these expressly exclude me. So I'm not subject to Social Security, and neither is my employer in Chapter 23, because the same definition of citizen is in 3306J. And then I got some other evidence that Social Security only applies to the possessions, including the 1935 Social Security Act, Section 211. The proof is everywhere. Social Security is never applied to Americans. And then you come to red number 2. Tax Code Chapter 1 identifies Americans as subject only in regulation. So the first argument says, let's talk about Chapters 2, 21, and 23 first. Then we'll get to Chapter 1. So I killed the first 3 chapters in Social Security, and then we go on to Chapter 1, the only chapter left, and I'm only named in a regulation. And here's Section 1 of the Tax Code in its entirety, the graduated income tax and Section 1H, capital gains. And nowhere does it mention somebody's citizenship, and right below that there's the regulation below that statute, written under that statute, that says, citizens of the U.S. owe this tax. Can't do that. And below that are the 29 decisions that say U.S. citizens owe the tax, see Section 1 and Regulation 1.1. How come you can't just say the regulation? In there, you see on the left, it's Court of Appeals 6th Circuit, Court of Appeals 7th Circuit. In bold, Court of Appeals 9th Circuit. Look at the Court of Appeals 7th Circuit. I'll put the quote into the chat. U.S. versus Vallone. The 7th Circuit Court of Appeals said this. U.S. versus Vallone, and this is a 2012 decision. Vallone wrote a letter to the IRS in which he made a variety of baseless claims, including the assertions that he enjoyed certain rights unique to a sovereign citizen born in the United States, that he was neither a citizen nor resident of the United States as those terms are used in the 14th Amendment or in 26 CFR 1.1-1, the IRS regulation identifying those persons who are subject to the income tax by the United States. End quote. Okay, so the 7th Circuit says the regulation identifies the subject. Thank you. It's exactly the argument I'm making. Right? Right? But when you make the argument, but only the regulation identifies those persons as subject, you get penalized thousands of dollars. And they won't talk about it. On the 7th Circuit last summer, the government, in this exchange of briefs, watch the chat, in this exchange of briefs, the government didn't even mention Section 1 of the tax code or that regulation to defend it as a regulation that's consistent with statute. Gotcha. Can you tell, are you starting to see, can you feel that my analytical capabilities are simply worlds above David Champion and Pete Hendrickson, when I can do this to the government over a couple of very simple issues, because I know which statutes to argue and how to argue them. I took out everything else from the argument and stuck with the biggest, the heaviest lifting arguments. This definitely is not my citizenship here in Social Security. Over here, this statute definitely does not mention anybody's citizenship, but the regulation does. I'm going to challenge that regulation as inconsistent from statute. Inconsistent with statute. And they won't talk about it. They'll penalize you $4,000. The 7th Circuit. So last year, I wrote 7th, 9th, and 11th appellate clients to the Supreme Court. And in one case, Lowell B. Craft wrote an amicus brief, and they just won't talk about the law. Whereas anybody else hands in their arguments, they'll get full discussion of the provisions relied upon, and they'll be proven wrong. Let me point out to you, this is the David Champion video of mine on my YouTube page. In there, you'll see me pull his wings off and roast him with a magnifying glass under the hot sun. There's the link there to YouTube. In that video, David Champion says, there's a brief at the very beginning, I believe, of the non-resident alien argument. And watch the video. The brief is segments A, B, and C. A, you're not a sovereign citizen. B, your state is not sovereign from the income tax. And C, Section 861 about non-resident aliens doesn't even work like you thought. You spent a moment in the statute and a lifetime in the regulations, and you're wrong for these reasons. I wrote issue C, the statutory analysis of 861. U.S. District Chief Judge Voorhees in North Carolina wrote issues A and B against the 861 argument in 1992. And anybody arguing non-resident alien is trying to tell you they can outright a federal district chief judge. Be careful, folks. And you'll see right there the non-resident alien status as early as 92 was briefed away, not just penalized with no explanation like they do these days. So I'm not going to use the argument. I'm a fast learner. There's a lot to learn, folks, and when you listen to their arguments, and go to Dave Champion's page and listen to a couple of his arguments, and he'll twist you around in a couple ways that might impress you. But when you look at the bottom lines I've arrived at for my arguments, you have to understand I did 100 times more research than he did, and I made 1,000,000 times more sense of the research I did than what he made of the research he did. And Pete Hendrickson is sitting over there with a, chewing on a razor blade. He may as well be. It's tragic. The anti-tax movement, they call themselves the tax honesty movement, refuses to be honest. They will not study Section 83, and they have not analyzed statute and regulation in depth, probably because they don't know how to. I'm going to read one quote in the chat. Sean, hi, David, I love your work, but I also study with Pete and Dave. I see differences, but I also see similarities. The main common factor that I see where all three of you are in agreement is that the general application of the tax code does not apply to U.S. citizens. There is no explicit statutory language within the tax code that mentions U.S. citizens because they know if it did, it would violate the Constitution, case law, and whatever. Part of this can be graced with some realism. It's easy to get confused about the tax code. If they had a better, let me see. I'll start by saying you know that they won't acknowledge the citizenship argument. I'm not a citizen of the U.S., I'm a non-resident alien. And if someone says that's the argument for them, they're not even in the same camp and they don't belong in the same camp. Like I said, in 1992, that argument was killed in U.S. District Court, and I got the memorandum. So they're simply wrong. If they had a better appreciation for maxims of law, they would see those statutory definitions in Social Security as a gold mine. I went through the tax code several times for different reasons. One of the reasons was I started at the beginning and I went through there and I looked for every single mention I could find of chapters 2 and 21. Chapter 2, Social Security Self-Employed. Chapter 21, FICA, Employee Social Security. I looked for references to statutes in those chapters. I looked for references to the names of those taxes and gathered them all together and threw out the ones where I didn't find an argument. I didn't find support for my allegation that the citizenship argument was correct, that it obviously is not U.S. citizens. But if somebody claims to not be a citizen of the U.S. and be a non-resident alien, they're in a totally different frame of research than me. The IRS says I'm a citizen of the United States, and I explain the tax code based on that. I don't explain my citizenship based on that allegation. I explain the tax code based on a presumption they're correct. Okay, I'm a citizen of the U.S. Then I'm not Social Security. That leaves just Chapter 1. I'm only named in a regulation. And even if I were subject to Chapter 1, how does Section 83 operate in your conclusion I owe a tax on my paycheck? 1, 2, 3. That's punch, punch, kick. Right there. Nobody has that. And it could only have been derived from way more research and a much better grasp on the fundamental tenets of American jurisprudence than they possess. I've been so far into the tax code to come out with only 42 provisions in 5 or 6 arguments. They hang their hats on one argument and they get other things wrong, and everyone knows they refuse to even learn Section 83. Just that degree of negligence terrifies me. Your paycheck is your paycheck. You can protect it if you want. And be prudent. But I'm the only one out there saying that caution is king. Do what the IRS says. Start a home business. Teach your children how to run a business at home so that you can gather all the allowable deductions. And trust me, the amount you'll end up paying them at the end of the year or quarterly or whatever is worth it, just to keep them out of your life. Question in the chat, guest 14, welcome. Totally new to all your work. I haven't filed a return since 2010. Recently received a notice of non-filing from my 2017 return. Which course should I check out to move forward with a remedy? I work, thank you, guest 14. Personally, I don't work on liens and levies or filing tax returns. I focus strictly on the possibility that a criminal investigation might begin or has begun, or that a grand jury has been convened. Because in those instances, my treatise from 1994, briefed and served on 80 members of Congress, New Year's of '06, has prevented more than a dozen indictments of people that were identically situated to people that Chris Chapman and I have seen go to prison time and time and time again. And we shut down IRS criminal investigations. Let me get you this. This is just a hoot. This guy went crazy with my work. He went crazy. Did everything with it, took it everywhere, served it on everybody, and listen to what L.T. Oates says he was able to do with my New Year's of 2006 criminal complaint to 80 members of Congress. There it is in the chat. Look at the top of that. This is March of 2019. He gave me this testimonial. David's joinder, that means he joined the criminal complaint that went to Congress. It's an affidavit you can file. David's joinder saved me from an IRS criminal investigation and federal indictment 8 years ago. It also stopped all wage garnishments and bank account seizures. Further, it stopped the South Carolina Department of Revenue from trying to collect $37,000 from me, and they haven't contacted me since then. That was 8 years ago. Thank you very much, David. So, in his instance, being able to legitimately accuse the government of racketeering and extortion for very particular violations of the tax code paid him every dividend. Every one. He slayed the dragon. Thank you, Leldon Thomas Oates. So it's not a matter of getting my courses. That's for knowledge. What you want to do is get H&R, this is to guest 14, you want to get H&R Block between you and the IRS as soon as possible. H&R Block knows what you can and can't do with the IRS. I've proven that you can't even do Section 83 with the IRS, and yet it explains whether or not you even have a relationship with the government when all you've done is sold your labor. So it's impossible. It's so few and far between, the victories on liens and levies, that I don't bother. I can't take it. It would depress me to depths from which I probably wouldn't recover. So I just concentrate on criminal charges, putting this complaint in people's hands as their complaint by helping them join it as a similarly situated co-complainant. And then it's up to them to run off copies of it and serve it on people that are stealing their money, and Lord only knows what they're going to be able to get. You know, in Kentucky, U.S. District Court, this is, his talk show name is Steel Billy. He's on my call a bunch of times and Chris's call, which is show number 87488, American Liberties 87488. John Steele of Kentucky, this is funny now. I'll get to your question in just a second. John Steele was sued for real estate. The DOJ sued him. They wanted to convert tax assessments into real estate. And so they sued him. Well, the real estate his wife got in a divorce several years ago. So here he is sued by the government. He has nothing at stake. I said, I'm not, if you had a house that you could lose or something, I'd recommend you go get an attorney, but I hate to see somebody just sit there for no reason, twiddling their thumbs, getting sued. You want to go on the offense? He says, yeah. So, as you see on my federal income taxation page of wevgov.com, there's an expression in the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights that says, in fact, let me go get that for you. That bears repeating. The taxpayers are entitled to know. Let me give you these. Where are these when you can't even have a clear explanation of the law? I gotta wonder. Let's see here. This is the Helvering versus Texpen Oil Company, Supreme Court, 1937. The taxpayers were entitled to know the basis of law and fact upon which the commissioner sought to sustain the deficiencies. The Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. I thought I got that in that copy paste, doggone it. Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. The Taxpayers' Bill of Rights says the taxpayers are entitled to know they're entitled to clear explanation of the laws. That's what they're entitled to. Let me go get it. Doggone it. You got to see it to believe it. They're entitled to clear explanation of the laws. And I'm looking on the wrong page, I bet. Anyway, you'll find it in my work. Entitled to clear explanation of the laws. And Steel Billy, John Steele, files that counterclaim in U.S. District Court, suing for a clear explanation of those provisions on the homepage of takefromcaesar.us, and they dismissed his counterclaim, said you can't have him. So I get around. He didn't even say my argument. Look, I don't owe this tax, and you can't do what you're doing to me based on my arguments. He just countersued for clear explanations that you're entitled to in the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, and he was denied. So civilly when they're after your money, lien and levy, whatever, tax returns, I got precious little to offer you. The law doesn't count here. It's in my disclaimer. On my other shows, just listen, you'll hear my disclaimer over and over again. The law doesn't matter here. The question in the chat is, or no, somebody's got their hand up. Yeah, 215 has the hand up. You are unmuted, I hope. You're on the air. Can you hear me now, 215? Oh, no. 215 is offline again. There you go. I unmuted your mic. Yeah, hi there. I can hear you.
Okay, great. I had a question. I started, before I get to the question, I wanted to tell you that I've been looking at you since 2010.
I'm sorry, just a second. You broke up a little bit. Say that all again.
I found you in 2010, and I was looking for a remedy, and I looked at everybody's stuff, and I found yours to be the most sound. And I was dealing with a situation where was not going to be able to pay the income tax as I had previously paid, right? And so I started looking at your stuff, and I started looking at all the tax movement and everything else, and looking at venue and jurisdiction and all this other stuff, and how to deal with the situation. And so I started basically by looking at your work and found everything to be perfectly in order. I didn't see anything wrong with it, contrary to what others were saying. And in the context of this talk show you have here today, as to the opponents of your work, and I just started thinking, okay, well, everything's operating out of maritime, and maritime works on this premise of every man's duty to know the law and to keep it, and ignorance of law is no excuse, and that's the guiding maxims that they operate by, and guilty till proven innocent under maritime as opposed to law or equity. I just thought, maybe I'll just ask the question, on the phone, and I got nowhere with it. The IRS, when I spoke to them, they were basically like, you're going to have to take those arguments to tax court. I said, these aren't arguments. I'm just asking questions. You sent an offer of contract with a Bill of Rights, taxpayer Bill of Rights, where you're stating that, your goal is to, allow the taxpayer to pay the least amount of tax possible. However, I'm asking questions about, what language is employed in there, because there's various different legal dictionaries and various different versions of those legal dictionaries, all which define an English word differently than the Webster's. And so I kind of need to know what version of English you're using before I can start to figure out how I'm going to approach. And the reason that I did that is because before I started getting into employing your work, I wanted to get away from assumption, presumption, and opinion. I was trying to get to facts and substance. And how everything that I said was pretty much like falling on deaf ears. And so it's like I started thinking, out of all the stuff that I've heard David talk about, it's like I had this question where, how does a person avoid this to begin with? I mean, you get this W-4, and it's like if you were an employee or a worker, however you want to refer to it, where the wording is concerned. How would you deal with it? Because the way that I dealt with it is I just filed exempt, because in their publications it states that you don't have to pay. You don't even have to file if you don't meet definition of single at 12,000 today. I mean, I can't go back to 2006, so I don't remember what it was. But today it's single 12,000 and married filing jointly 24,000. However, with subsection 83A, only the excess of the arm's length agreement is in question. So therefore, any bonus, like say for example, a bonus of $20,000, as I understand your work, in non-technical terms, the bonus then would be taxable, because that would be an excess over the arm's length agreement. So if I got a bonus of $20,000 and I'm filing single, the tax tables would apply to that bonus, that $20,000, with an exemption of $12,000 if we were speaking in today's tax tables. However, they don't seem to see it that way, and it's like exempt and exempt in the sense that you don't expect to pay any tax, because using the subsection 83A, you wouldn't
Yeah,
you wouldn't
and
pay any tax.
pardon me
So therefore, you wouldn't have to file.
if I may, all the work in the last 4.5 years proves all of that really moot. Everything is meaningless. You can't have an answer on everything. The law never matters, and we want to know when you're going to give us your bleeping money. So it doesn't matter it doesn't matter that the bonus is over the amount paid. They aren't even going to look at the statute. You can't even sue for the government's interpretation of it. I just put in the chat a link to an IRS Internal Revenue Manual where if they're going to prosecute you, oh, they got interpretations. Oh, yeah. And here's how to prosecute somebody. You're going to find 7203, failure to file, 7201, tax evasion in here. No discussion whatsoever of how to calculate the tax. None. And so none of it even matters. The language of statute that governs doesn't even matter when you can prove it protects you. So it's way worse than the acquaintance with my work that you have at present. It's way worse than all that. As we've just proven, I got the docket numbers to prove it. You got the Robert Orth page of wevgov.com on the 7th Circuit. They just kill you if you contradict the government. If you think the law protects you, they'll hammer you into the ground like a thumbtack. So let's mature your understanding to the point of futility, that you can't have anything. Don't even ask, citizen breath. And the best thing you could do is bitch out your congressperson. And build your record so that if, in fact, you're not going to file and not going to pay, it's much less likely you'll experience a criminal investigation or an indictment.
Well, I'm going to join your co-complaint. I got to get the money order this week and get it out if I'm going to join that. I think the offensive strategy is the best because, asking questions to remove yourself from a presumption or opinion perspective is not going anywhere. It's like where's the disclosure? You have to disclose what it is you're giving me, and if I can't read, it's like someone gives me a document that's written in Chinese.
Right.
I don't know Chinese.
And more importantly, this approach, these bottom lines, that already that they can't refute, which are governing statutes that obviously protect you. It opens up the opportunity to take a step further and say, hey, this is my demand for an explanation of Section 83. I read the Robert Orth case, and you can't even talk about it. I think this attached criminal complaint and my affidavit of joinder is proof that I don't owe. If you need any more proof of my innocence, just tell me. I'll give you another wheelbarrow full. I don't believe for 1 minute I have a duty. I've read the Robert Orth case. You can't even talk about the law. And that's a step closer to the government than anybody else can take, to be able to just say, if you want another mountain of proof I'm innocent, just say so, because I've got it.
I wanted to say something else about that comment you made earlier in the discussion tonight, where somebody was speaking about how subsection 83 pertains to stocks. I did some research on that because early on in 2010 I started looking at that, but then I saw the subsection 83A, and I found, and I'm still to this day since 2010, still trying to find the link to this, but I think the origins of that come from Unum Sanctum of 1306. And I'm like I said, it's a lot of work trying to figure out, trying to chase this down, but I think the definition as the IRS sees it is actually out of Unum Sanctum of 1306, which was actually, presented in 1302. But, if you look in there, and even since '86, when they tried to combine all the jurisdictions of law, equity, admiralty, and maritime into one, so that everybody could, I think it comes from the Holy See.
Just a second. You're going way further than you have to. Plain statutory language and case law prove everything you need to prove about this argument. You don't have to theorize beyond what they've already said. It's really way easier. Everything's done, and I use only what I found in written decisions to pull their pants down. So there's nothing else I need to know. And this, by the way, is in the chat. Cone versus Commissioner. Thanks for your questions. It's getting near the top of the hour. I'm going to have to, and I appreciate your presence on the call, believe it. Cone versus Commissioner, 1969 tax case, 1974? It's 1979, excuse me. This is about restricted stock plans, and tax courts get into the intent behind the enactment of Section 83, and then they said, however, Congress was aware its coverage extended beyond restricted stock plans for employees. So you want to read that entire paragraph. So that consideration has been made by the courts and reiterated a couple times that the original intent was for restricted stock plans, creative compensation plans for corporate CEOs, but the courts have applied it to everything, and in the Robert Orth decision and exchange of briefs, you see that they don't deny it. They acknowledge that Section 83 governs, and they won't talk about it. So Pete probably took the Hubble tax guide off of the shelf and said, oh, Section 83, huh? And looked up some accountant's take on Section 83 who hadn't read all the case law that says Section 83 explains how to tax the entire workforce. Anyway, folks, this has been my pleasure. The tax honesty movement is dishonest. It is dishonesty incarnate. They will not do the work. I've obviously done tons more research, made a lot more sense of it than David Champion or Pete Hendrickson. And quite frankly, I didn't know that the tax honesty movement was the anti-tax movement or the patriot movement. I didn't know they changed their name. I thought the tax honesty movement was the people pushing for a fair tax or something else, and they're guilty of the same negligence. You're calling it a tax. How'd the law operate in your conclusion? It's a tax. Well, we don't have to learn the law. Why don't we just pass a Fair Tax Act, and that way the government can keep collecting what we've never even owed it, to legitimize the illegal revenue stream called the tax code. Anyway, again, my name is David Merlin. None of this is legal advice. I'll probably archive this here on TalkShoe. I did record it, and take note of the contents of my YouTube channel. It's dynamite. Take from Caesar. It's just crammed so densely with important information about the law and your rights that I can't describe it. And I will not ask for an apology about the way I speak about the movement, because they're sending people to prison, and the movement just won't stop, and they refuse knowledge. It's all been proven right here in front of you. Thanks again for sharing your Tuesday night with me. Enjoy the rest of it, and I'll see you tomorrow on 87488, 87488 at 4 p.m. Pacific. In the chat, Sean says thanks. My pleasure. Everybody have a good night.